Hey everybody, so in this video I'm going to talk about how to review practice tests for the MCAT. Now, I've talked in previous videos about how, in my opinion, the single most useful resource for the MCAT is the AAMC practice tests. And the reason why those are the most useful resource is not really because of the act of taking them itself, although that's useful. It's the act of reviewing them after the fact, right? So reviewing your practice tests, I think a lot of people kind of neglect that. A lot of people kind of don't give it the amount of time that they should. And so I'm going to talk here about how you want to do that. So the first thing that I would recommend is that you don't review your practice test on the same day that you take it. So take your practice test and then take the rest of the day off, right? You want to approach the practice test with your brain kind of fresh. So again, when you take your practice test, take the rest of the day off, and then the next day when you're a bit refreshed, that's when you do your review. And depending on how well you're doing, I think reviewing your practice tests can take between a couple days to even a week or longer. And that's because when I say reviewing, I don't just mean, reviewing the questions. I also mean reviewing the content that's based off of those questions. So if you're getting a lot of questions wrong, you might want to go section by section. And if you're not getting a lot of questions wrong, if there aren't that many questions, then you can kind of just review the whole test at once and then do the content for that. It sort of depends on your preference. But let's say that you are getting a decent number of questions wrong. And so maybe you decide to do section by section. And so I would recommend, it's not required, but I would recommend you start with the section that you did the worst on, just because they're going to be the most questions for that section. And now you can kind of go question by question. And so I've created a bit of a decision tree that you can follow to kind of, review your practice questions. So the first question obviously is, did I get the question right? And if you got the question right, then you don't have to worry about this. Now, later on, I will give you advice for people who are scoring above, 510-ish, people who are scoring very well. This will change. But for now, if you're scoring, if you're scoring below that, then you've got a lot of room for improvement with the questions that you got wrong. So focus on the questions that you get wrong. Did I get the question right? If not, what did I get wrong about the question? So in general, there are going to be two different reasons why you might get a question wrong. Either you get the question wrong because you didn't understand the passage or the reasoning. And so, for example, maybe there was a line in the passage that you missed, or maybe the passage itself was a little bit, confusing and you just kind of, you misunderstood the logic, or maybe you understood everything and then you just sort of, you had a bit of a brain fart and you missed the question. That sometimes happens, right? And in that case, what you want to do is, if this is why you missed a question, you want to write out an explanation of the correct answer and why the correct answer is the correct answer, and then why, what your thought process was. Hopefully, if you're reviewing your practice test, immediately after you've taken it, it's not going to be, it's going to be pretty fresh in your memory, like why you got the wrong answer, why what the reasoning process you used was. But you want to explain to yourself what the correct reasoning process is. And I would recommend you try to do this yourself. So try to figure this out yourself. And it actually helps you because one of the things that helps you is that the AAMC's explanations are actually not very good. And so you're sort of going to be sitting there trying to figure out, okay, so then why is the correct answer, right? Try to reason through it yourself. Try to figure out what is the argument for why this answer is correct. I would say this type of approach particularly is helpful on cars. And if you need to double check, there are some pretty good explanations. For example, Jack Weston has some really good explanations for the AAMC exams. And I will say, I think you should do this in writing specifically. And the reason why you should do this in writing is because you don't want to kind of, sometimes we sort of will tell ourselves, oh, I understand why this is wrong. And then we'll sort of just move on. And so that's not good enough. You really have to write it down. You have to explain it to yourself in writing to make it clear, that you understand why this is wrong or why the correct answer is the correct answer. Now, the other reason why you might get a question wrong, of course, is content. Typically, you didn't know a correct answer. You didn't know, you didn't understand something. There was a particular idea or particular concept or particular subject that you should have reviewed more that you didn't understand. And so in this case, what you want to do is you want to find out what the content that's being tested is, and you want to write it down. Now, I'm going to explain more what I mean by this in a sec. And then the third type of a point is that oftentimes questions, you get a question wrong for both of these reasons, right? There was both, a content gap. So maybe you didn't quite understand the passage because there's a lot of content that you're missing. And so if you had understood the content, you would have understood the passage. Or maybe you just read the passage and you were completely lost and you ended up having to make a complete guess. So in that case, you want to kind of follow both of these approaches. You want to both approach this as a content question and as a passage/reasoning question. And so that gets me to this sample spreadsheet that you can use that I've created. And you can download this on my website, acmcat.com/resources. And I'll put the link down below. And you can always feel free to modify this spreadsheet or kind of create your own, modeled after this, or you could do this on paper yourself. If you prefer to handwrite, I often find that handwriting, really helps me to remember stuff better. So I prefer to handwrite actually. And so I might create something like this, but, on paper. And so essentially what you want to do is you want to write down what number the question is. Why did I miss it? Is it content? Is it reasoning, or is it both? You want to explain the reasoning, if that applies. And then when you find the content for the particular question, you want to first write down what is the subject. So physics, gen chem, orgo, biochem, bio. And then what is the specific content section? Now, if you go to, again, acmcat.com/resources, you'll find my outline of the AAMC's content where I've kind of broken it up into these different subjects. So you can kind of pick the subject that's, that content is from. And then the specific content. So for example, here I just kind of wrote as a sample, calculating resistance for a circuit. Or for this one, let's say it's a question about prokaryotes and viruses, and it's understanding virus protein codes. And so let's say you're just reviewing the Chem Phys section. You want to go through all the Chem Phys questions that you got wrong, list them out, explain why you got them wrong, explain what the content that's being tested is, and then write it down. And at this point, patterns should kind of emerge for you. So you should find patterns that are emerging of what your weaknesses are. So for example, maybe you're getting a lot of questions about amino acids wrong, and that's probably a sign that it's time for you to review amino acids. Now, you don't have to review all the content. So maybe you get a question wrong, but you feel like it's a question about a type of a concept that's so low yield that maybe it's not worth reviewing. Well, in that case, at least you still at least want to flag it. You want to sort of have a list of subjects that you haven't reviewed, or subjects that maybe, that you've kind of flagged. I would call these kind of known unknowns. And so what happens is that if you are doing the next practice test and you come across this subject, well, at least you kind of know that there's a content gap, that, I'm probably not going to get this question because, I have a content gap on, X subject, right? And of course, if you've put something on your have not reviewed list and you come across it again, on the next practice test, then maybe it's not so low yield and maybe it's time for you to review it. But again, having that list of subjects really kind of helps you to be aware of what your content gaps are. And I always find it actually helps me to solve those types of questions, because now that I know that I don't know something, then I'm not sitting there struggling, trying to figure out if there's something I should know here, if this should be a lot easier for me. It's just I know that there's a subject that I haven't reviewed, and so I can kind of make my guess on this practice test and move on. And something like that might also come up on your real MCAT, and still the same thing. At least you know that this is something that I haven't, that I'm not quite sure about, and so I can make my best guess and move on and not try to waste too much time trying to figure it out. And so let's say you do decide to review a subject. So let's say, for example, you're missing a couple of questions on electricity, and you decide, I've got a weakness here with this idea of calculating resistance. Typically, what I find is that if you have a weakness in one subject, you probably have a weakness in the general, in the general content section. So it's not just the specific content. So what I would recommend is you go to that general content section and review it. And so again, you can find my AAMC content outline here at acmcat.com. So for example, let's say I missed a question about calculating resistance. So I can go to the content outline and look at everything that's covered under electricity. So this is all the stuff that's covered under electricity. So in this case, maybe I've got a couple weaknesses here, right? Now, some of this content is low yield. This is, everything that's going to be covered under electricity. So maybe this is pretty low yield, but maybe it might be worth it for me to not just, for example, figure out how to calculate resistance, but how to calculate, the whole thing about resistance. So not just resistance, but reviewing Ohm's law, maybe reviewing resistors in series and parallel, and then reviewing this idea of resistivity. And so from that, we identify not just the kind of the really, really narrow gaps in our knowledge, but the more general gaps in our knowledge. And so this is why this type of outline is really valuable. And the same thing for the next one. So prokaryotes and viruses. So I can go down to the bio section here in the outline. I can scroll down to prokaryotes and viruses. And so again, let's say I got a question wrong about the structure of a virus. Well, I can kind of review everything about viruses, let's say. Probably if I miss one question about it, there might be a weakness for me in the general subject of viruses. And then I can try and find resources, that'll cover this. So I could use Khan Academy, I can use some of the MCAT-specific textbooks, or I can use, non-MCAT-specific textbooks if I've got textbooks related to, my pre-med classes or, videos online or video playlists online. It doesn't so much matter what specific resources you use as making sure to generally review those subjects. And so again, you can be strategic about what you review and what you don't review. Usually I think that it's, you have to miss more than one question about a subject for it to become worth it to review that subject. And when I say subject specifically, I'm referring to these subheadings. So here, prokaryotes and viruses. If I miss one question that's really detailed about viruses, maybe it's not worth it. But then when I miss another question about it, well, now, I probably should review that. And so this is why it's useful to flag the questions that you get wrong, even if you decide not to review the specific subject, on that particular go around. And so going back to this, once you've reviewed the content, the subject, then you click this check and it crosses out the subject. And so again, you can mess around with this spreadsheet, change it up as you want. I've just sort of created it kind of as a sample to kind of show you how I recommend you approach this. And I would love to hear in the comments down below, what changes you made or what changes you recommend or any thoughts that you have about this. Now, going back to this content map, I said that this is what I recommend for if you're scoring below, say, a 510-ish on your practices, that if you get the question right, there's no need to review it. Now, if you really want to maximize your score, and so you've kind of maximized all the sort of the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that you really need to review, and you're trying to get into, really trying to squeeze every single point or every single correct answer out of the test, right? Once you get above, say, a 510, it really starts to matter every single question you get wrong. And so in that case, it's not enough to just get a question right. So this is where I've created a new map that says that if you get the question right, did you understand everything about the question? Right? So sometimes you get a question right because you happen to guess, or you happen to kind of get lucky. And so if not, if I didn't understand everything about the question, I should, what part was I unsure about? And then I should follow this map, right? If it's content that I was unsure about, then I should still review the content, even if I got it right. If it's the passage or the reasoning, I should try and explain it to myself. And if I do understand everything about the question, I still have to answer the question, did I understand the wrong answer choices? So for example, and again, this is where you're really starting to try and maximize, your points. This is where, you can do this if you're scoring generally very well. Maybe I understood the question and I understood what the correct answer was, but I didn't quite understand why the wrong answer choices were wrong. Maybe some of those wrong, maybe I got the right answer and I looked at the other answer choices and I was like, I don't really know what those are. So I'm just going to assume that the right answer, the one that I think is right is right. Well, maybe it's time for you to review some of those wrong answers as well. Why are those wrong answers wrong? And so the way that I recommend this essentially is, let's say the correct answer was B. So I can basically say the correct answer was B because, and then explain it to myself. And then I can say A refers to something different. And then I explain what A is. C refers to this. D refers to this. And if I can't do that, then there's probably a bit of a content gap. Again, whether it's worth addressing sort of depends on how you're doing, but it might be worth at least flagging it in the spreadsheet, as I was saying. And so again, if yes, you're good. If no, then there might be, some content that's worth reviewing. And so as you can start to see, this type of review should take quite a bit of time, right? For every question that you get wrong, there may be several hours of content review. And as I said, you may not have to do it for every single question. You may decide to put something on hold. But in general, there's a lot of material for you to review after every single practice test. And so this is really how I recommend you approach reviewing your practice tests. It's going to create a lot of content for you. It's going to create a lot of reviewing that you're going to have to do. And so again, practice tests can be a great resource for you to figure out your content gaps in a way that allows you to focus really on the more high yield stuff. Because at the end of the day, nobody's really going to understand everything that's tested on the MCAT. You're going to have to pick and choose what specifically you review. And I find the best way to understand that and to do that is when you review practice tests. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below or shoot me an email. And thank you for watching.